Thank you so much for inviting me, Camille and Yazzie, to be part of this webinar today. And any chance I get to talk about agroforestry and trees, I'm really excited to do. So before I get started, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, you are good to
Wonderful.
go.
Great. Well, my name is Katie Adams, and I'm the Demonstration Farm Network Director here at the Savannah Institute. The Savannah Institute is a nonprofit organization based in the Midwest that's really focused on laying the groundwork for widespread agroforestry. Agroforestry at its very basis, and I'll talk more about this, is just trees on farms on purpose. And that's really what drew me to this work here in the Midwest. I'm based here in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, but I grew up in Southern Illinois, right on the edge of the rolling hills of the Shawnee National Forest. And one of the most amazing things about growing up in Southern Illinois is the diversity of landscapes that are there. We have an incredible national forest, the Shawnee. We have diversified agriculture. I could drive 10 minutes in one direction and be in a corn or soybean field, 10 minutes in another direction and see cattle grazing, 10 minutes in another direction and be in an orchard, 10 minutes somewhere else, and then stumble upon a fruit or vegetable operation, a small scale fruit or veg operation. And so growing up in Southern Illinois really gave me this very particular context of people living on the land for themselves, people living on the land to produce food for others, and then folks that are just living with nature itself. And then folks that didn't even realize that all of these things were happening outside of their doorstep. And so I don't come from a farming family, but my grandparents were farmers, grew up on farms. My great uncle was still farming up until a couple of years ago. And I was really drawn back into agriculture through my study in anthropology, which is really just the study of people. And the type of anthropology I was doing was looking at why people were making the decisions they were making and building particular knowledges around agriculture itself. And so I'm really lucky to have this background in anthropology that is really looking at relationships. And that's what all but agriculture is just relationships. People are making decisions to be in relationship with each other and the land through agriculture. And so I came to SI through a meandering sort of education experience of working on vegetable farms, working in a vineyard, working for regenerative livestock producers, and then ended up in my position now helping build a network of farms that are demonstrating what adding trees on farms can look like. And so before I get too much into what agroforestry is, I think it's really important to situate us both in time and place. In my work here in Illinois, I do this work on the unceded homelands and territories of the Piankashaw, Wea, Muskogean, Adawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Kickapoo, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Miami, and Osete Sakowin people. And these are folks from across Illinois that their ancestral lands are here. They had an incredible impact on what we think of as the natural world. The oak savannas, the large prairies, the tall grass prairies, the abundant forests full of nuts and fruit and other medicinal plants are here because of these people. And these people are still doing this work, even though they were forcibly removed from what's now the state of Illinois. Kickapoo and Peoria folks have really strong histories of doing agroforestry work in the location that they were removed to. And for the Prairie Band of Potawatomi people, they now have tribal sovereignty back here in the state of Illinois because they were able to purchase back some of the land that was taken from them. So these are living people that are still doing this work, and so we don't want to just think of them in the past. And we can thank agroforestry and our work with trees to the ancestral knowledge of folks that are native to here as well as native to parts of Africa, Asia, what's now Central and South America. Most people were growing food through relationship with trees. And that's particularly true here in East Central Illinois, where I am now, which you might think of as like prime corn and soybean country. Uh, the mass majority of our state is in agricultural production, but where I am here, which most people think is kind of the seat of corn and soybean production, was not always the rich farmland that it is today. Where I am here in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, it was a malarial swamp. It was actively avoided by settlers. No one wanted to live here. The only reason people started coming here is because they could harvest salt from the salt fork and different rivers and streams around this area. And when folks came, one of the reasons they hated being here, besides the swampy, kind of mosquito-y landscape, was because it was covered in hazelnuts and wild plums. And so we had a very wet prairie here that was covered in shrubby things. And so when folks tell me that trees were never on this landscape, they were, and they weren't actually, trees and shrubs were here not that long ago. But once folks came in and started plowing and draining, then the landscape changed pretty dramatically. Um, and so what we have now, once Native folks were moved from the land, once we started kind of plowing and draining agricultural land here in the state of Illinois, 75% of our land is in agriculture. And only 6% of that, 75% is what's thought of as set-aside conservation. So land that's kind of to the side of agricultural production or in between that. And here, this picture is an interesting one because this is a graveyard. This is a cemetery. So in some places, conservation just might be a set-aside area that actually has another purpose. And then we only have about 3% of what we'd call our quote unquote natural lands left. And for prairies, that's 0.03% of our original tall grass and short grass prairies in the state. And so what this led to, 75% of our land turning into agriculture, is we've seen a huge rise in nitrogen and phosphorus water pollution. We have agriculture that's increasingly using artificial and conventional inputs that then wash away into our groundwater and into our surface water. We're still seeing large amounts of soil erosion. While we've made good strides in this, increased weather has shown the kind of instability of our soils and the lack of living roots in there and the biological health that's just causing our soil to leave our farms, our most valuable assets. And we're also seeing large amounts of pesticide toxicity. If you're not familiar with some of the herbicide issues and insecticide issues that we're facing here in Illinois, there's a great a report from Prairie Rivers Network that talks about our kind of pesticide toxicity levels here in the state. That would be an interesting resource for folks to check out. But while we're facing kind of these really big issues on our farmland and our communities, that doesn't mean that we can't change what's happening. And for Savannah Institute and folks that are looking at how perennial systems can do this, we're really excited about how perennial roots in the soil can help address these particular things. By putting roots in the soil that aren't disturbed year after year, we can actually capture and hold those nutrients. We can keep that soil in place, and by adding diversity of species back into systems, we can also bring back birds, help increase beneficial insect populations, and cut down on some of the pesticide and sometimes even herbicide usage that we see as part of kind of the status quo or businesses as usual in agricultural systems. And so at the Savannah Institute, we think agroforestry is one of those perennial options. And kind of by definition, agroforestry is an integrated approach to farming with trees and other crops that's really focused on multiple benefits of adding trees to farmlands. Sometimes I like to think of this as a toolbox or a Swiss Army knife, because trees, the right tree in the right place at the right time, can do very particular things for farm businesses and landscapes. And so like with all sort of interventions within agriculture, we can always maximize one potential outcome, but we still might get some of the others. So for example, if you want to diversify farm income by adding trees onto a farm, we might choose something that has a guaranteed market or a high income level. Like here in the Midwest, we see an emerging chestnut market. But we'll still get the benefits of sequestering carbon and purifying water and providing wildlife habitat, but our choices might have increased outcome in one area more than another. And so the USDA defines 5 different agroforestry practices that they support for research, for funding, and for technical assistance. The first is alley cropping, which is the cultivation of crops between alleys of regularly spaced trees and shrubs. So that could be grain production, could be vegetable production, could be cut floral production, and adding trees directly into those production fields, which can sound a little counterintuitive. But when we look at adding trees into grain systems, which is what we have here, and this is a first year photo, so those white things you see on the screen there are timber trees. Um, we're stacking two different enterprises in one. We're seeing the benefits of long-term and short-term and long-term cropping systems. And we see that oftentimes adding trees increases yield for adjacent crops. And this is Hudson Farm, which is a farm that I manage here in Central Illinois. The next one is silvopasture, which is the integration of trees, pasture, and livestock within a single system. And before I go any further with this practice, I have to be very clear that silvopasture isn't turning cows into the woods or pigs into a wooded area. That silvopasture is intensive, both in design and management, and is something where you're specifically looking at the health of the pasture, the health of the livestock, and the health of the trees as kind of a supported system. And so there's two types of silvopasture. The first is silvopasture by addition, where we're planting trees directly into pasture for shade, for livestock, which we know is increasingly important. And that shade can also be beneficial for forage quality and health as well. For fodder, for producing potentially food for the livestock itself as an alternative food source, or to supplement the diet of whatever ruminants you're bringing into the system. Or for increasing the biodiversity of the forage itself. And then the second type of silvopasture is silvopasture by subtraction. And this is where we're looking at already existing stands of trees or forest land and looking at maximizing the potential to have pasture underneath those trees. This can be particularly important if you're facing huge invasive species issues within a woodland. The intentional and intensive utilization of things like goats or bringing different types of livestock through can help with invasive species that could also help boost the health of the trees that you want to keep within that system. And so one way that can look like is introducing livestock into already existing tree systems. So this is an apple orchard, and they're bringing cattle in after the harvest of the apples themselves, or sometimes at the beginning of the season, depending on the Food Safety Modernization Act sort of guidelines, and utilizing the cattle to graze in between the trees themselves, potentially stop pest and disease cycles from happening early or late in the season, and to provide some different forage for the cattle. The third practice are riparian forest buffers. And these are strips of permanent vegetation along any sort of body of water, from lakes and streams to more kind of stationary bodies like ponds or lakes. And here we're really utilizing multifunctional kind of woody things, trees and shrubs, to stabilize soil, to purify water, to keep debris from running into waterways. And that can look like pure conservation, like we sometimes see in forest preserve or conservation districts, or it can be combined with agriculture. So here's an example of a riparian forest buffer where they're planting elderberry alongside their lake. And so they have a wooded area, they have an intensive elderberry production area, they have a little bit of more wild or unmanaged vegetation, and then the lake itself. So they're utilizing kind of an area which might have a little bit more saturated soil, but they're adding a productive element into that riparian area. The fourth one are windbreaks. These are just strips of trees and shrubs along the edges of farm fields that are really there to provide conservation benefit or enhance crop production or livestock comfort. Windbreaks used to be very commonplace across the plains and here in the Midwest. but we've seen a decrease in the utilization of windbreaks. One, because we have windbreaks that are aging that were put in around the time of the large conservation movement after the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and the need for many row crop farmers to have to maximize the areas that they're growing in. And so the 80s farm crisis and the fence post to fence post sort of farming approach kind of was the death sentence for windbreaks. However, we're seeing kind of a revival of folks wanting to put them back in, especially when looking at wind stress, as well as if you're an organic producer or regenerative producer wanting to have some buffers between your fields and your neighbor's field. And then on some smaller acreage farms, we can also stack a windbreak. So if you see in the background this photo, this is a Vulcan farm, a farm that I used to manage. We had a 5-row windbreak of trees, and then we added another buffer with a pollinator planting. And so we can stack multiple benefits on the buffer zones of farms using perennial systems. And then the last one is forest farming. And this is the cultivation of specialty crops underneath existing forest canopies. So this is also sometimes looped in with food forests. They're slightly different, but basically it's production of food at multiple layers, utilizing the benefits of the tree canopy itself. So this includes growing things like mushrooms, the cultivation of ginseng, blue cohosh, other sort of medicinals, depending on where you are. And this can be done by cultivating wild stands that are already existing, planting those sort of things in, or managing other types of crops that need the shade to really flourish. And so a big one that folks are utilizing more recently, especially on a smaller scale, is mushroom production. So here is a picture of some shiitake log inoculation where folks are preparing to get them underneath the forest canopies because they need shade and some wetness to be able to produce. And this also utilizes any sort of waste or scrap wood that might be coming off of a woodlot that could then go right back in to that system. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of agroforestry, but I want to give you a little bit of information on why we're so focused on the role of trees in agriculture. So we have these practices, but so what? What are they actually doing? And trees have some very particular characteristics that make them really powerful within farm context. It goes without saying, but trees are perennial. That means that they continue to live year after year without having to replant them. And so we get to like plant once, maintain them, and reap kind of their benefit for years to come. They're woody, which is also one of those like, well, duh, like trees have wood. But woody things have very particular benefits, particularly when it comes to climate mitigation and nutrient mitigation. The fact that they have trunks and branches that can store things like carbon, store things like nitrogen or phosphorus, and then make them available or not available depending on what's needed in the ecosystem is a really phenomenal trait of trees. And they can do this through their adaptive and relational root systems. So we have the growth above the ground and this awesome storage capacity. And then we have this system below the ground in which the roots can really get information from the soil, from the ecosystem below the soil, and communicate with within the tree itself and other living beings and systems to store things, release things, send water, pick up water in a really phenomenal way. And trees also create those communities over time, and they get stronger and stronger and stronger. So the more that we have perennial roots in the ground, the stronger those biological and fungal communities can get over time. And another obvious one is they're just really beautiful. Most people have a particular relationship with a tree or a species of trees. And bringing those back into our farm landscapes can be a way to harness that beauty and joy. Okay, so here's a couple reasons why we plant trees and encourage folks to plant trees on their own lands. The first is that trees create really vital habitat. And we're talking about vertebrates, we're talking about invertebrates, we're talking about fungal communities that are really important for soil health. And they are really important for pollinator populations. And pollination is very important for many crops, but specifically for the crops that we eat. So anything that has blossom and pollen, we need those pollinators within that system. And even things that are self-pollinating benefit from increased pollinator presence within there. I mentioned this earlier, but they improve water quality. This is particularly important not only for our own communities. So here in rural Illinois, we have issues with groundwater contamination and well contamination, where folks are literally being poisoned by the own water underneath their feet. But this is also important if we think about our neighbors and friends down the Mississippi River, and particularly within the Gulf of Mexico. We all have a role to play in that. And our state EPA is getting really involved in that. And nothing is more efficient at pulling phosphorus specifically out of the ground than tree roots. And so we can add those to our system. A big one that we focus on here at SI is the ability to draw down and hold carbon and sequester carbon, both within our root systems, but also in the woody biomass of the tree itself. The longer that tree is there, the more carbon it can hold. And even when we might cut down a tree for timber, for the most part, that carbon doesn't get released so much into the atmosphere, but actually stores that for longer within the durable timber products that we have. And then the tree roots are sinking that carbon at deeper soil horizons, which actually benefits soil health, and particularly organic matter. We need carbon at deep soil horizons to have increased or durable organic matter in our soils. And the great thing about the carbon storage of trees is that trees, and particularly agroforestry systems, they can both mitigate climate impact, but also it helps us adapt to it. Trees can help create beneficial microclimates. They can help with water availability. They increase biodiversity. It helps us kind of weather extreme weather patterns and unpredictable cooling and warming cycles that are harder to deal with on the farm these days. And then I mentioned soil health a little bit ago, but all of the conversation I've had so far is really to get to soil health. This is a big reason why we're interested in regenerative and perennial systems, is because the quality of our soil and the health of our soil is the number one foundational thing that we should be working towards. And because we're reliant on it not only for our food, but for all these other things, climate, water quality, biodiversity and habitat. It's really, the soil is really the root of it. And so we have a whole other webinar on agroforestry and soil health that I would recommend, because I don't have time to go in all of that today. And then at the end of it, we can grow things that people actually want to eat and buy. And so agroforestry isn't just a conservation system, but if we're adding trees into our systems that are producing fruit, like elderberries, black currants, cane fruit like blackberries and raspberries, apples, pears, or nuts like hazelnuts and chestnuts and northern pecans, then we're utilizing the power of the tree itself to actually produce a second, third, fourth crop for our farming systems. And as we know, and as things are changing, particularly within agricultural supports, diversity is one of the most powerful things we can do for our farm businesses. We can't predict the weather, we can't predict commodity markets, but we can predict a little bit more what to expect with our cropping systems. And if one fails, we want to be able to rely on another. Okay, so I've been talking with you for about 25 minutes, and you might be thinking, okay, you have some watercolor things, you've been talking at a high level, but what does this actually look like? Like, what does the systems, how do they actually function on the ground? And I'm going to provide 2 examples that I'm personally involved in and have helped design and run and manage over the years, and then one particular project that I've been advising on another farm. Okay, so our first example here is Memorial 4-H Camp Demonstration Farm. This is in Piatt County, Illinois. And this is 35 acres of timber and conventional row crop alley cropping. And so if we're looking at this picture here, this is corn that's being grown here. You'll see that it's surrounded by forest land. This is at Allerton Park, if folks are familiar with that. And so what we did is worked with the current farmer that had been farming this land for the past 3 decades to design a system where we're planting rows of timber trees directly in with this corn and soybean rotation. And this was a kind of a proof of concept and a partnership building work where we could work one-on-one with a row crop farmer to see what works, what doesn't work, what types of yields we're seeing, what sort of issues we were running into. And it was really important that we kept this farm production focused first, with conservation kind of layered on top within the field. The great thing about this farm is that our row crop partner does what he does best, and what he knows, which is continue to farm in the way he has, with some exceptions on chemicals that could harm the trees themselves. And then I and the Savannah Institute and our partners manage the tree rows. So we have 2 partners, 2 farming systems, with one outcome, which is production and conservation happening in field. And because we're a nonprofit organization, we have to do some research in there too. And so what we're looking at is different timber tree species. So we're looking at, this is black locust, which you can see as the main tree species here, which we're experimenting with as a fast growing native to here tree where we can get timber for boardwood at year 30 compared to things like oaks, which we might have to wait 85 to 125 years to harvest that timber. We're looking at, so we have black locust, we have oaks, shagbark hickory, and black walnut as our timber species. And then we're also looking at different ground covers underneath those trees. So we have one of the ground covers that we're experimenting with is a combination of Dutch white clover and perennial ryegrass, pretty low maintenance, low mow, kind of low diversity, not super deep roots, but it covers the ground really well. And then we're also looking at shortgrass prairie. So what does it look like to add shortgrass prairie in with timber tree plantings, in with conventional corn and soy production? And then looking at maintenance treatments within that. So mowing versus using kind of weed barrier versus herbicide ban, and looking at tree health, ecosystem indicators, as well as labor hours and cost. We're also monitoring water quality and carbon sequestration rates, and we have a hybrid hazelnut trial. And those hybrid hazelnuts are a combination of American and European genetics. And so this is what the design looks like from above. And so you'll notice that anywhere that has kind of a color that's not that deep green is a tree row. And we did 3 rows of trees with each section of trees that we added in there. They're running west to east. And the reason they're running west to east is to mitigate some water that would run across the property from the northeastern side to the southwestern side. So we're putting the tree row specifically there to stop, slow down, and spread out water. And it also matched the way that a row crop farmer was moving his equipment throughout the field. We designed this to maximize his efficiency so that he wouldn't have to do a single extra pass when we added these tree rows in, and that worked really well. We could talk about the farm all day, but we have a limited time. And so this is a picture from the first year of harvest. This went in the ground in 2020. And I don't have an updated picture of harvest because he always harvests when I'm out of town. And so I haven't actually had a chance to get back and take an updated photo. But the harvest hasn't changed, his cultivation hasn't changed. And we've been a couple years of just making sure that he's able to still do what he does, and then we're able to maximize what's happening. And so we do a lot of kind of basic sort of monitoring. We look at prairie species, pollinator counts. We do biometric data where we're looking at height and tree growth and all of these things compared to different species, different ground covers, and different management treatments. And so what we've seen over the years is that up until this year, there's been zero impact between the corn and soybean sections and then the tree sections. And then this year is where we're going to expect to see a little bit of shade impact from the trees, starting in year 6. But we know from research that the shade impact is actually mitigated by yield increases in field. And so as we're adding in trees, while there might be a dip in yield right next to the tree rows, you see an increase in yield in field thanks to the perennial roots and sharing of water and nutrients, as well as the microclimate benefits of having trees next to furrows. So we're hoping that the research out of Europe and the Great Plains will be true here in the Midwest as well. The second example that I have is from Hudson Demonstration Farm here in Urbana, Illinois, where I am. And this is a 120-acre grain, timber, and specialty crop alley cropping farm with a windbreak on it. And so we have a 20-acre multifunctional windbreak that's been financed through the Farm Service Agency Conservation Reserve Program. So government paid for every single tree that went on this farm, including the windbreak. We have 70 acres of timber and conventional grain alley cropping similar to the farm we just looked at. And then we have 30 acres of fruit, nut, and habitat alley cropping. So we're planting elderberry and black currants between rows of heart nuts, which are a Japanese walnut. And then we're planting pollinator habitat between rows of hazelnuts. And this farm is really designed to, one, showcase how NRCS and FSA can help support alley cropping, windbreaks, and agroforestry practices. The second goal is to deploy precision ag technology. So every tree in this system has a geotag. We can put it into GPS guidance systems. They were planted using a tree planter that was tracking the exact location of every tree. And then we're also, this farm is also kind of at scale to drive and then get markets and aggregation up for perennial crops and small scale specialty timber that's coming off this farm. And so here's the design of that, of kind of where things are located. You notice that we have drainage tile, that there's some wet spots within the field, and we're really monitoring how different things are performing underneath those drainage scenarios, underneath those wet and heavy soils, and seeing how trees, rather than say pattern tile drainage, can help address some of those issues. Also at this farm, still looking at water quality and carbon sequestration, as well as looking at different widths between tree rows for alley cropping, how that impacts yield for green crops. And so what that looks like, this was established in 2022, and what we've seen is an explosion of abundance on this farm. It amazes me how fast things can change when we take a conventional corn and soybean field and then put perennial roots in the soil. So this was technically season 3, and the prairie that we planted 2 years ago was blooming like crazy for the first time. And we planted this prairie right in between rows of hazelnuts, not off to the side, but right within the production system, because we think that having those prairie plants there are going to increase production and health of those hazelnuts. We're seeing a crazy drop in weed pressure every year that we don't till that soil. Weed pressure gets better year in year. We're slowly seeing increases in bird populations. So when we first got into the field and started planting, we only had killdeers, and now we have over 40 species that have been seen on this farm, which is really exciting. And we had our first harvest this year of elderberries come off the farm. So while we work in perennial systems, we can start getting harvest at year 3 for some particular crops that we have put in there. And it's been great working with our row crop partner to learn how their GPS guidance systems are working with the kind of location specific work that we're doing with these tree rows as well. Okay, and our last example before we kind of wrap things up and open it up to questions is a specialty crop alley cropping farm here in Urbana that's utilizing windbreaks, pollinators, as well as alley cropping. So most of the work I do here in Illinois is focused on row crops, but we do work with farmers that are also using it for specialty crop production. And so here on Tulagradia Farm, they're dividing up their veg operation into half-acre blocks and then planting trees on either side of them, or shrubs that can go directly into their farmers market sales, their CSA sales, and they specifically need those trees to be there for one, microclimate benefits. Veggies are really suffering with drought. They're really suffering from extreme weather shifts. And so microclimate benefits are going to be really important for them, as well as helping lower their irrigation costs. If we can have a little bit of shade at particular times of year, they can drop irrigation a little bit. And then the big one is beneficial pests. They want to be bringing birds in, they want to be bringing parasitic wasps in, and they want to be providing habitat for the things, for the predators that, for the insects and pests that eat their vegetables. So they planted hazelnuts, pears, apples, raspberries, pie cherries, pawpaws, all of these fruits that folks have been asking for, they can now add into their system. And instead of putting it to the side in an orchard setting, they integrated it right in the production area itself. And they just started planting. They planted one block last year and is planting a ton again this year. Okay. So there's value in adding trees to farmlands, but Savannah Institute exists because folks don't have the resources or the education or the knowledge yet to see agroforestry as kind of a viable, adoptable, scalable practice. And so we exist for this particular reason, because we want to take this kind of agricultural conservation, natural area, artificial divisions, and then just bring them back together onto one farm, which is a radical concept, especially here in the I-States and the Corn Belt. So it takes a little time to get folks on board. And so we're here to do the research, the education, and the outreach, sort of to make that possible for folks. We have a huge staff. When I first started in 2018, I was employee number 6. We have 46 people now. And one of the reasons why we've grown so fast is, one, demand from farmers. We had to match kind of the demand that we're seeing. And 2, we've had some great investment from the US government during the last administration, as well as from foundations and other folks that want the research to get caught up. Like, we need research happening, we need folks talking about this, and we need technical service for farmers. And so we work in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa to do this work in supporting farmers and getting place-based, location-specific research out there. We have a tree crop breeding program to help sort of get the crops that we think are really well suited for diverse perennial systems off the ground. Every crop that I've mentioned so far is part of our breeding program, plus a couple others. So I encourage you to go to our website and check those things out. We provide one-on-one technical service to farmers to help them ideate, plan, design, and apply for funding for agroforestry. So every state I mentioned, I need to update the slide, sorry about that. Every state I mentioned, we have a technical service provider in that state, not just Illinois, Wisconsin anymore. We offer an apprenticeship program for young folks that want to get paired with a mentor to do agroforestry. And then I run a network of demonstration farms in Illinois and Wisconsin, and we're expanding to a couple other states as well, so that you can come see what agroforestry looks like in your area and your context. Check out our YouTube channel, which has tons of farm tours and presentations like the soil health one I mentioned. And then we also have a podcast and a blog that you can check out. to learn more. I'll just also plug our sister company, Canopy Farm Management, that does perennial farm management as well as tree establishment if you're in Illinois or Wisconsin. So we actually have a company that can help make this a reality for folks. And I think now is the time for agroforestry. There's a reason why I'm so passionate about this. I've seen what trees can do on farm landscapes, and I'm excited to grow with these systems that we're starting to get established and for my kiddo to be part of this work too. And so I encourage you to join us at an upcoming event this next year, especially on farm. And with that, I'll open it up for questions and ideas and scathing rebuttals.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was an awesome presentation and feel very lucky to just have you here with us. So we appreciate you. We are going to open it up for questions for Katie or for us or for anyone that's here. Feel free to type in the chat or you can unmute yourself and we will sort of go from there. We have about 13 minutes left and we'll use the last few minutes just to kind of wrap things up with upcoming events and sessions and whatnot. So does anyone have any questions to start things off for Katie or for anyone here? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I just want to thank you as the sponsors as well as the Savannah Institute. I mean, it's a fabulous, what you're doing is just absolutely fabulous and so important. Um, I I myself, I work with a company called um, Continuum Carbon Services, and right now we're doing our first 46,000 acres in Canada. And this next season, we're gonna, start in the Upper Mississippi Valley and Missouri Valley. And it just, we have 12 land use practices and shelter belts and pollinators and biostimulants are each has their own practice, and it all helps sequester carbon, and it's fairly well known. It just I absolutely loved the integrating with conventional farming and getting actually getting the economics to work. And I know both as the sponsors and as the Savannah Institute, I mean, it's like so important to integrate into the existing farmers and grow it out as you can. And so I just stand in awe. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And could you say the name again? The continuous carbon, what was
It's
entity?
Continuum Carbon Services, and we're based in Minnesota, although all our operations are in Canada today. So in the prairie areas of Canada.
Yeah,
Thank you,
for your work.
John.
That's exciting to learn.
Yeah, thanks for being here with us. Jalinda asked a question in the chat for you, Katie. What about Missouri? It's on the map you showed, but I didn't see anything happening there. Thank you for the great information.
Yeah, Missouri is really lucky because Missouri has the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry. And they have long-term research that are happening there. They have a great chestnut breeding program as well as other nuts, as well as field trials. And they're just now starting a technical advisement and outreach arm of their work. And so Missouri is on there because it's kind of broadly Midwest, but we really rely on our partners there to do that work. And we work really closely with them. And we also have had a couple mentor farms through the apprenticeship program that were based in Missouri. And if you're in Missouri, I was farming in Missouri before I moved here to work for Savannah Institute, and there's some really exciting agroforestry happening there.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. I just wanted to say one other thing, John, in response to your comment. I think Katie did such a great job of showing everybody how this agroforestry idea can be integrated into any system. And it's so important when we're all talking with farmers about, approaching people where they're at. And so I just encourage everyone to, yeah, use Katie as a resource and use the Savannah Institute as a resource. And us at Enlightened Soil Core, we do a lot of highly consultative educational work for whole systems. And so, if anyone's interested in learning more about that or using any of the resources that Katie has or that we have on our team, please reach out to us because we would love to talk with you about your operation and your goals. I have a question, Katie, and so oftentimes we are meeting people who, maybe this is something that they haven't really thought about from a practical standpoint of integrating, but really believe in the concept and understand the benefit. And I'm curious from like a step-by-step level, how do you all work with beginners who are curious and want to start this, but maybe need to start small and think about the cost benefit analysis of it, and what do those steps look like?
Yeah, great question. And there's lots of different ways depending on people's goals and their resources and their land availability that can inform that. But the big one is one, outlining your goals. So trees on farms can work really well, but only if you're utilizing them to achieve the goals that you want. If if okay, so one example is if one of your goals is to be off the farm all winter, you want a snowbird and you want to live somewhere else during the winter when it's cold. You don't want to plant any fruit trees because fruit trees need pruning. And so if you're not back from Florida before bud break, you're not going to get any fruit on those trees. And so aligning personal goals with farm production goals with farm economic goals is really important. Do you need cash flow soon? Do you need cash flow later? Is there a market already set up in your area, or are you a direct to sale person that can integrate those things in? Just basic goal setting is really key. So looking at your ecosystem, your farm business, and then your personal life. The second one is being clear-eyed about skill set. And so what skills do you currently have? What skills can you pull from your network on? And that also ties into interest around that too. Like, can you do the work? Are you gonna get someone else to do the work? Do you have the equipment? Do you need someone else? And sometimes this can be really silly to think about those things when you're like, I'm just thinking about agroforestry. Why would I ask my questions now? And the answer is because planting trees is a long-term endeavor. You have to make sure you can see it through for the long haul. And then the third is like looking at your property itself and looking at the natural resources that are there, what's happening in the soil, what's happening above the ground, what type of, is this the right place for trees? Does there need to be soil mitigation before you can even plant a tree and hope that those trees are going to survive? What types of soils and climate are appropriate for some of the species that you're looking at? And then the third is like thinking through practices and the scale of them and where they might go. So oftentimes we'll encourage folks to start small. And one of the easiest things to do is start on the edges. So see where you can throw in a hedge or a windbreak somewhere. It doesn't have to be covering the full kind of outline of the farm. It could be looking at, I'm just going to put it on the northeast corner and like have it be really tiny because we get really horrible prevailing winds in the winter from the northeast. And let's just put some protection there to keep soil that might be barren in the winter from blowing away in the winter or the spring. And so when we work, one of the ways you can do that at Savannah Institute is we're working on a workbook to help bring folks through that practice, which is going to be released next year. When you sign up for technical service, that's like the first step is have a conversation about all these things, a technical service provider. And then we just have a ton of information on our website, including a tool from our partners at Canopy called Canopy Compass, which looks at soils and tree crop suitability. So that's a lot of information for a really simple question, but oftentimes we ask folks to ask themselves questions when they're wanting to get started.